Hello friends, my name is Ash, and on this channel we talk about costuming and live action roleplay. And there hasn't been nearly enough live action roleplay content, so welcome to the first installment of a series focused on LARP costumes. In this series of videos I'm going to be talking about how you put together a costume, or rather a wardrobe, for a field-based or camping LARP event. Although I'm pretty sure you could extend that to any sort of non-historical costumed event, like a Fair. Field or Fest LARPs are some of the most popular games and among the easiest to discover as a first-time LARPer, due to the fact that they're huge and heavily publicised. But I think they're also one of the most challenging games to create kit for. Not only does your costume have to be creative, memorable and evocative, it also has to deal with everything the British weather can throw at it for an entire weekend. Which... mud. Mostly a lot of rain and mud. I've made another video all about how you go about designing a costume, which I will link up above, so for this one I'm not going to reiterate too much of the creative side of things, and instead focus on the practical considerations involved in specifically kit for a field game. Definitions. If you're new to LARP or not from the UK, kit is the word we use for costume. I believe in some other parts of the English-speaking world the preferred term is garb. It all means the same thing. It's what you wear, and broadly, all the stuff that your character has. Sometimes people refer to soft kit as specifically clothes to distinguish from armour and weapons. I don't care enough about that distinction to bother. So, while I do intend this video to have as broad an appeal as possible, given the subject, I will be specifically talking about creating kit for games with a couple of defining factors. They're very large, having several hundred to several thousand participants. They're entirely outdoors, with tents providing the vast majority, if not the only, in-character structures, and they assume that most, if not all, of their players will be camping for a full weekend game. These are most commonly called Fest LARPs, which is short for Festival LARP, given their similarities to music festivals like Glastonbury in setup and weather curse. But I will refer to them interchangeably as field camping or fest games because I'm a disaster. In the UK, I'm aware of at least 5 such games, but I'm not going to be focusing on a specific game or specific briefs within those games. I currently play none, although if the global pandemic carries on the way it has been, that might have to change. So I'm not invested in biasing this towards a particular system. I want you to be able to adapt this information to whatever game and whatever brief suits you. I will be largely focused on the UK because that's where I live, but equally with small changes, many of the principles will apply to most places. I just know less about the weather, availability and wildlife where you are. Limitations. For a variety of reasons that I will go into in just a second, when kitting a character for a Fest LARP, you don't so much need a costume as a wardrobe. That's why it's important to set limitations on yourself early on, or everything will get horribly out of hand. Depending on your situation, your limitations might be one or more of the following. Budget. This doesn't have to be an expensive project. The minimum requirements can be achieved on very little money, and I'm a cheapskate. But you can also pretty much spend as much money as you want. If you need to set a limit, do. If you don't, consider setting one anyway, because this can get ridiculous. Broadly, if you're prepared to make some compromises, you should be able to sort a costume for most briefs, for most games, on about £30. And provided you're okay doing at least a little sewing, it shouldn't look like a budget version. I should note, however, that does not include footwear, which we will get to in a moment. Weight and bulk. You need to be able to transport the stuff to site, along with a tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, etc. If you're travelling in a car and space isn't an issue, great! But if you're car sharing or taking public transport to site, you probably don't want a tent like Hoopalander or a dress that weighs 10 kilograms on its own. I speak from experience. Physical. You are most likely going to have to put this costume on your own, in a tent you can't stand up in, and then squeeze it into a tiny cubicle when you have to go to the bathroom. If you can't lace up the back of your bodice on your own, can you guarantee there's going to be another person there to help you? I'm sharing a tent with a friend is not a guarantee. If not, you should probably pick something that does up in the front. Don't assume you'll be able to put the tricky bits on outside either. The British weather sees you, judges you, and will rain at exactly the wrong time just to spite you. You do also need to think about how your wardrobe is going to fare when, not if, when, the entire field turns into a quagmire of sticky mud several feet deep, eating the footwear of people who didn't bring properly fitting boots. If you're eyeing up a floor-length heavy velvet gown that you could only really wear in cold but completely dry weather, consider something knee-length instead. Time. Even if you do so and want to make at least some of your items, how long is that going to take? How long do you have? Do those two numbers match up or not? I mean, I already know they don't, because they never do. If you're not experienced at working to deadlines or super confident in your speed, it's better to limit yourself to making 1 or 2 items, with maybe a couple more as stretch goals if things go really well, and make them the items that will really matter. Make the elaborate heraldic outer gown or the distinctive coat that everyone will recognise and there's no way you could buy. Don't sit and make 3 shifts by hand and then run out of time for anything else and end up hiding them under secondhand Primark. Skill level. If you're a beginner just starting out on your sewing journey, you're not feeling super confident and you know you panic if things go wrong, maybe don't decide you're going to make an original practice Renaissance doublet from scratch and hinge your whole character on this. I'm not saying don't ever do it, just have a backup plan. If you're trying to build your confidence, adding trim, changing buttons, and making small alterations are good ways to put an individual touch to your costume and build up your skills. Conversely, if you're a chaos goblin that cannot be contained and you want to make something ambitious that you know will be horribly constructed and you don't care, go wild and wear the disastrous results. I promise you fewer people will notice than you think. Quality. It's good to decide early on what you are and aren't willing to compromise on, quality-wise. If you're a beginner sewist but really care about having all natural fibres, you might commit your budget to real wool fabric, but have to accept that the stitching is not going to be the best. Conversely, you might be able to find a really nice looking fast fashion item that looks the way you want, but it's not going to be made of the nicest material. And even if you go the whole hog and drop cash dollar on head to toe Arm Street, it won't be as original or unique as kits someone has made. There are always compromises and there are no wrong answers, and you shouldn't judge yourself by other people's standards, just what you personally care about. What I will say though is that if you're tempted to tell other people about your personal quality standards and how they are the best TM, please don't. This is not a reenactment and absolutely nobody wants you to turn it into one. The person who has done the entirely appropriate £30 kit run via the charity shop is having just a good time as you are and doesn't need you ruining it for no good reason. Improvement. Most Fest games run 2 to 4 events a year, every year, and provided your character doesn't die, you can keep playing them for potentially a very long time. That means you have ample opportunity to change, upgrade, replace, improve, and modify your wardrobe going forwards. Your initial wardrobe is draft 1. The goal for me here is not to get you to your final form, is to make sure that at event 1 you have all the groundwork covered. Before we begin, boots. Before we do anything else, before we get into costume and character and sewing and shopping and all of that nonsense, you need decent boots and you need to wear them. Rule number 1, they have to be waterproof. I know, the event's in summer, I don't care, just trust me on this, waterproof. Rule number 2, they have to fit you. You want to fit your boots over one pair of proper boot socks. I have 2 kinds that I like. These guys are single layered hiking socks. These ones are double layered, so they have an inner and an outer. Sealskins also work if that's what you're into. I'm personally not a fan, but I know a lot of people are. Some people like hand knitted hiking socks, which Godspeed you mad goblins. They're all completely fine, but you need to get the socks first and you need to make sure the boots fit with just those socks. In reality, you'll have some wiggle room further down the line where you can wear a thin extra liner sock or tights under your boot socks, or a less chunky sock during hot events, but that one pair of boot socks is your baseline. Now, I cut my teeth on long distance hiking, so I'm going to let you in on a terrible secret. At LARP, I have 2 pairs of socks. One pair I wear, one pair is backup in case they get wet. Yes, by the end of the weekend, they stink, and no, nobody who isn't sharing a tent with you notices. If you're fancy or normal, you might want extra pairs of socks so you can, I don't know, wear clean ones every day or something, but I don't want to hear about anyone wearing 4 pairs of socks with their boots. You're wearing the wrong socks, these boots don't fit, and they will kill you. It's only a slight exaggeration. If you don't know what a well-fitting pair of boots feels like, get advice. Ask the shop assistants. Ask your friend who was in Scouts or did Duke of Edinburgh. Ask your dad. You don't have to explain LARPing to the boot people and go outdoors, just explain the kind of conditions you're expecting. This is a decision you want to make once and not think about again for 5 years minimum. It's worth doing right. Spoiler alert, if they rub, pinch, routinely give you blisters, or can be pulled off your feet when fully done up, they don't fit. So what kind of boots are actually on offer? As long as it fits, is waterproof, has decent treads on the bottom and protects your toes, you can't really go wrong. Looking in character is great, but an optional extra and not something you should prioritize over any of those other points. If people give you grief for your footwear, you should eat them, or ignore them for being jerks. The potential options you might already have in your wardrobe if you're not a hiker are either a pair of leather fashion boots like Dr. Martens or Timberlands, or trainers. I love Doc Martens, I wear them for some events. The major downside is that they're not insulated and they don't have a lot of internal support. They can cause blisters more easily, especially if you've not broken them in. Please break them in. And they do leak if there's enough groundwater. Also, they're really nice and really expensive, and a very wet event can just destroy them. But if you already own them and have no other options, they are okay. Now for the most controversial thing I'll say all video. In some circumstances, some trainers are fine for LARP. Not all trainers. Do not show up to a field event in road shoes. Fashion trainers are right out. But if you already own a pair of cross-country or fell running trainers, ones that are specifically designed designed for running on mud and grass and have a heavy tread like these, but not studs. Don't wear studs to LARP. And you don't have an alternative, they are better than fashion shoes. I would much rather you have ugly feet and not die than the alternative, and I judge anyone who says otherwise. Now for purpose-built shoes, assuming you're going to buy something. The cheapest option you're likely to come across easily is also sadly the least in character looking, which is a pair of inexpensive hiking boots. You're looking at about 20 to 40 pounds on these, but they will stay comfortable and waterproof for a surprisingly long time. And you can find these at basically any hiking shop, some sports shops, and online at a pinch, although I don't recommend that. You really want to try these on and make sure they fit right. Also, if you don't like the brightly coloured flashes some of them have, you can colour them in with Sharpie to make them less obvious. The more in-character option from a similar shop is a pair of leather hiking boots. These are going to set you back closer to £100, if not more, and will require upkeep. But a good pair of leather boots that you treat and polish regularly will last for decades. Personally, I cannot be bothered with that nonsense, so I just buy new synthetics every 8 years, but you know, carbon footprint and all that. There's also army surplus or combat boots, which are great if you can find a pair. They come in very neutral looking leather options, they're not outrageously expensive, the ones I could find for around 40 to 80 pounds, and they have a reputation for resilience and longevity. But you have to find a specialist supplier, and they tend to mostly come in men's sizes, which is really not ideal if you have small or narrow feet. There's a fourth option, which is particularly good if you have a game that is notorious for mud, which is yard or muck boots from a horse riding supplier. The main advantage of these is that they come in knee-high versions and with the expectation that you will be literally wading through filth, so no fussy closures. They're like Wellington boots, but with treads and insulation and that fit your feet instead of sliding off all the time. Don't wear Wellingtons. They seem like a good idea. You will lose them when the mud really gets going. Definitely don't fight in them. Yard boots can also look really in character because they're styled after riding boots. Note, however, that you do want yard or muck boots, not actual riding boots, because riding boots are pitched at an angle to encourage the correct ankle position in the saddle, and that makes them uncomfortable to walk around in for a long time. Ask me how I know. Unfortunately, they do tend to be on the pricier side and don't come with the same kind of aggressive ankle and foot support that hiking boots do. In summary, prioritize your footwear. You are going to an outdoor event where you'll be dealing with varied terrain, unexpected weather conditions, and potentially running and fighting over difficult ground. You need to be able to rely on your feet being warm, dry, stable, and protected for a full 48 hours. If your feet hurt, if your feet are wet, if your feet are cold, you will not have a good time. That's enough digressions, time to... Before we begin, Redux. There is one more thing we need to talk about as a baseline for every field or indeed outdoor LARP costume you'll ever put together, and that is ticks. Lyme's disease is on the rise in the UK. It's potentially very serious, and every outdoor event I have ever been to has had at least one attached tick. I personally have been bitten twice, but weirdly never at LARP, and I'm careful. They don't hibernate, they're active all year round, and they're on the increase and spreading to more areas of the country. Basically, whether it's a known tick area or not, just assume there will be ticks at every outdoor event you go to, and that you don't want them on you if at all possible. So what do? As a baseline, minimize exposed skin and wear insect repellent. Tucking your trousers into your socks is a good habit to get into in general. For LARP specifically, I'm often wearing skirts or robes, so tights. Tights are amazing. You're basically covered from toes to waist and they keep you warm. I actually wear tights basically all the time. Tights are very stretchy, but tights specifically designed with more room in the crotch do exist if you're worried about fit. I know cycling stores will carry a variety of styles, some of them even have shoulder straps, which I'm faintly jealous of, but not enough to pay the excess. Do remember that if you're playing a game that involves combat, particularly if it has strike down rules or if it involves hiding and sneaking, you're going to end up on the ground at some point, or indeed any game that involves substantial woodland has the capability to drop ticks on you from higher up. So you want to be thinking not just about exposed skin on your legs, but on your upper body as well. I tend to cover what I can and then barrier the edges of my clothing with insect repellent. And finally, every evening if you have enough light, or after the event if you don't, check you didn't get bit. No matter how good you think your barriers were, check all of you. Ticks love armpits. And removing them isn't difficult as long as you're careful. Always pack a pair of tweezers. Even if you think you didn't get bitten, learn the symptoms of Lyme's disease and be on the lookout for the following couple of weeks. There's no way to make yourself perfectly tick protected, but take some basic sensible precautions and learn how to spot and deal with ticks. I'll have a link in the description box below with more information about ticks and Lyme's disease. Okay, for real this time, let's get on to the costume. What do you actually need? Your wardrobe is going to broadly break down to a couple of major groups, and you should think about having things that cover all these bases. To be clear, I'm not talking about having a huge number of different items. Like any good capsule wardrobe, 10 key pieces or less, plus maybe accessories, is a good baseline. You will need base layers or underclothes, clothes, main garments, distinctive garments, protective clothing, practical accessories, and decorative accessories. Some items might do double duty across different categories, or represent different categories in different weather conditions. You just want to make sure that all of those are represented somehow in your final wardrobe. I find it also helps to think of how you would adapt your wardrobe seasonally, the main seasons being spring, summer, autumn, and winter, or in layman's terms, high temperatures, low temperatures, rain, and wind. Several Fest games have seasonal events, but let's be honest, we live in the UK and you should probably assume any combination of these four things could happen at any game. We've had snowstorms at events before, anything is possible. Let's break this down. Base layers. Base layers are what you wear closest to the skin or under your other costume pieces. They're incredibly flexible because most of the time they won't be seen or will only be partially visible, so they don't actually have to be in character or on brief. This category covers a huge variety of items from shirts and shifts, leggings or hose, long sleeve t-shirts, simple tunics and dresses, petticoats, corset stays and skirt supports if your brief supports that, even thermals. Their main job is to soak up sweat and keep you warm. Having at least one in-character-ish base layer item is a good idea in the long run, just because if you have a simple linen tunic or generic LARP shirt and leggings, you can wear just that on a really hot day or while pottering around camp first thing in the morning, or even to sleep in if you're camping in character. But then you also have that available to layer under other clothes if it's colder. But remember that most of the time, these won't ever be seen, so don't stress about them too much. If you're planning a handmade wardrobe, these should be the last thing on your list. Apart from my thermals, I don't have a lot of purpose-made base layers. I use a combination of modern clothes from my everyday wardrobe, like plain long-sleeve tops, tank tops, leggings, ruffled skirts worn as petticoats, and nicer garments that, for example, have an icy-ish looking neckline to fill in a lower-cut tunic, but are otherwise obviously modern. But also when I make mock-ups for fancier and more complicated garments, and I'm pretty happy with the fit, I tend to make them out of old sheets or plain cotton and just roughly finish them off so they're wearable but kind of ugly. Sometimes I don't even hem them. I'm not invested in these clothes, they're just there as an extra layer for warmth and a sweat guard. They need to be something I can just throw in the washing machine. They're going to get treated really harshly compared to the more distinctive outer garments, so I'm not going to spend that much time on them. But I'm making a mock-up anyway, and I would just throw it out or cut it up, so half the work's already done. With base layers, the goal for most people is to have something clean to change into each day. So about 3 items, maybe more if you're separating top and bottom. Main garments. This is the meat of your wardrobe, and if you're going with a capsule of 10-ish items, maybe 4 or 5 of them will be main pieces. You're looking to strike the balance here between characterful and appropriate and versatile and accessible. Unlike your base layers, these garments should be as on brief as you can manage. So look at your brief in detail to identify what are the key shapes, eras and colours you should be looking at. Again, however, for most briefs you can get away with appropriate looking modern clothing with some small modifications, and I'm going to go into that more in a future video. Equally, if you enjoy making costumes, there's a lot of ground here to cover. Think about your seasonal options when picking out main garments. As previously mentioned, your main piece for a very hot day might be a base layer the rest of the time, but you ideally want at least one warm garment for when it's very cold, one that dries quickly for when it's raining, one that is tightly woven and not too loose and flappy to keep the wind out, and so on. I find for these things it also helps if you can strike a balance between something that is appropriate for your character and something that is not so distinctively associated with that one character that you can never use it for anything else ever again. Your main pieces are allowed to be a little bit generic and simple, especially at the beginning, because their job is to be versatile and unobtrusive. Hit the major points of the brief, have an appropriate colour scheme, make sure you're covered for all weather conditions, don't go overboard on the details. In the same way that you have fairly average looking jeans or a couple of generic plain shirts in your real life wardrobe because they go with everything, not every piece of your character's wardrobe has to be 100% tailored to that character's unique and memorable style. That's the job of distinctive clothing. Basically, you want one piece in your capsule wardrobe that is obviously and unmistakably that character. If you only want to sew or commission one item of clothing for this whole project, consider picking this one. Or keep an eye out when shopping for dramatic, unique clothing with wow factor. This is the place to let the incredibly specific bit of the brief have free rein, but also to do something wild and uncommon. Note that distinctive doesn't have to mean complicated or elaborate. A bold tabard or a strong and unusual colour choice is just as valid as an intricately decorated doublet or beautifully fitted gown. There's 2 things you want to bear in mind for your distinctive item. 1, you want to wear it most of the time, which means making it suitable for as many different weather conditions as possible and making sure it works with all your other items. And 2, you want it to be visible, so ideally outerwear. Things like tabards, surcoats, cloaks, mantles and stoles, robes, coats and sleeves are great options that you can throw on over most different outfits. Pick one that works well for you. And if you can't decide, remember that as you build and develop this character over multiple events, you can add more distinctive pieces. Maybe your first event is likely to be colder, so you make a warm robe, but between that event and the high summer event, you have time to make a lightweight surcoat with a similar aesthetic. Protective clothing. Protective clothing's job is to do exactly what it says on the tin. Protect your body from the various elements and weather conditions at play. Protective clothing overlaps heavily with all the other categories. Thermals are a protective base layer. A warm tunic is a protective main piece. A broad-brimmed sun hat or shielding hood are protective accessories. A coat is both distinctive and protecting you from the elements. The main thing you need to think about in this category that isn't necessarily covered anywhere else is what you wear when, again, not if, when, it rains heavily. Now, the historical answer to this question would be a cloak or coat and a lot of wool, but honestly, when it comes to LARP events, that mostly just means getting quite wet and not necessarily being able to dry out your stuff because you're in a tent in a field. At this point, someone is probably going to pop up and try and explain that wool is waterproof, which... Okay kids, sit down. Wool itself as a fibre is somewhat water resistant. That is not the same as waterproof. However, the fibre itself isn't the whole picture. You also need to factor in how it's been processed and how it's been spun and woven. Wool on the sheep is waterproof because it's full of grease, a special grease called lanolin. And if you have raw wool that hasn't had the lanolin stripped off, then yes, that's fairly waterproof. You almost certainly don't though. That's not really a thing anymore unless you're processing from raw fleece at home. Equally, while the wool fibres are still water resistant once the lanolin is stripped off, as it is for all commercial processes, loosely spun and loosely woven wool creates lots of space between the water-resistant fibres for the water to run down and soak through. If you want anything even remotely waterproof, you want a densely spun, densely woven wool, ideally felted or at the very least fulled, which is really expensive and hard to source. And then it's not so much that it's actually waterproof as it's very, very water resistant and going to take a large amount of water to soak all the way through to your skin, which is possible if it's raining heavily enough, and by which time it weighs 3 times as much, is being damaged by the weight of all that water, is rapidly cooling itself and you down, and is never going to dry out before you leave sight. I hope you like transporting sodden wool, and could potentially start rotting if not cleaned and dried properly and promptly when you get home. Don't get me wrong, wool is amazing. It's an incredible fibre, it has many wonderful properties, and the most water resistant option out of all of the natural fibres. But it isn't the magic answer to the rain question, especially not when it rains as heavily as it does sometimes in the UK. Wool is a whole lifestyle choice, and just to reiterate, often an incredibly expensive one. The thing about LARP is that it's not just standing around in a field in costume. You're playing a game. You don't want to find yourself in a position where it's either stay in the tent alone talking to nobody and stay dry, or go out and follow plot and find your friends and actually, play the game and get soaked and cold. Your life will be much, much easier and more straightforward if you are at least somewhat actually waterproof. Basically what I'm getting at here is there are cheating options. The biggest rain hack is having a cheap, thin, waterproof jacket and wearing it under a loose layer that you don't mind getting wet. If your kit brief lets you wear some kind of hood or head covering, so much the better. There's also a variety of wash-in or spray-on waterproofing solutions to experiment with, so if you already have a pretty good coat or cloak, you can add an extra layer of protection. Note that these are mostly formulated for smoother fabrics like plain weave cotton, so nick washing your wool jumper isn't going to work quite as well. Finally, it's important to remember that while there are a lot of negatives to polyester fabric and other plastic-based synthetics, mostly that they are plastic and therefore terrible for the environment, they will still keep you warm while wet, which most natural fibres won't. They aren't damaged by excessive water in the way that wool is, and they dry very, very quickly. They're also cheap. There's a nasty undercurrent in some communities of people trying to shame other players for wearing synthetic fabrics, and I think it's important that we recognise that, aside from the fact that gatekeeping based on how expensive someone's kit is the absolute worst kind of behaviour and you should get in the sea, man-made fibres do have a clear advantage in some situations. Just buy second-hand or recycle if you can. There's enough polyester in the world. We just need to move it around to where it's needed rather than making more. Practical accessories. Belt, pouch, bag. Practical accessories actually covers a huge range of things. From hoods and hats for hot, cold or raining weather, scarves and shawls, gloves, belts, in-character looking useful objects like a watch, notebook and writing implements, wooden pencils with a distinctive marking standard off, or a water bottle. Wrap a plastic one in a big handkerchief if you're just starting out. But I cannot overstate how incredibly important it is that you have somewhere to put stuff. In-character bags are great for field games because you end up hauling around a lot more stuff in general, as well as your in and out of character wallets and keys, etc. Previously mentioned notebooks and water bottles. You probably also want room for snacks, extra items of clothing in case it gets colder or because it's got hotter, any important character items or props that you've brought with you or loot that you've found lying around unattended and just picked up so it would be safe and looked after, OC first aid kit, IC medics kit, fake blood, sunscreen, bug repellent, deck of cards or set of dice, a fan, ritual equipment, and 6,000 pamphlets that people have given you in play. Just get a bag. Get a bag you can easily carry around in character and that sort of fits with your costume. It doesn't have to be fancy or expensive, you just want something. Also, I heckin' love belt pouches, and honestly want to wear them basically all of the time. Like, I personally think pockets are overrated. They often ruin the line of your dress. But belt pouches is where it's at. Decorative accessories. And then there are decorative accessories, which is basically everything else, as well as hoods, hats, hairpins, headscarves, earrings, necklaces, collars, gorgets, scarves, shawls, and sashes. You've got sleeves, gloves, mittens, gauntlets, bracelets, rings, fans, brooches, and belts, not to mention leg wraps, garters, skirt hikes, scabbards, flowers, baskets, masks, veils, handkerchiefs, aprons, and literally anything else you can think of putting on your body. You can materially change the look of an outfit by swapping out the colours and aesthetic of your accessories. Lots of flowers, lace, and gold filigree lends one aesthetic to this plain dress. Leather and steel a very different one. Don't forget either that you can incorporate makeup, nail art, and hairstyles to further accentuate your character. The sky is basically the limit, and I would say once you've got the basics of your wardrobe down, more and better accessories will round out your costume and make it more versatile and more visually interesting for less time, money, and space than extra large garment items. The elephant in the room. You're going to notice that at no point during this have I mentioned armour or weapons. So, I come mainly from a role-playing tradition that is kind of laid back when it comes to combat. It's not the main focus of the game, nobody really cares if you're wearing enough armour or what armour is made from, so weapon and armour choices end up being a lot about aesthetics, not very much about anything else. The same is not true of fest LARPs. Managing combat across dozens if not hundreds of participants and keeping it interesting and fair needs a bigger and more complex rule set, and that means what weapons and armour you pick will probably have a lot more to do with the rules than what you think looks cool, and I am not the best person to advise on that. Additionally, weapons and armour are expensive, and armour in particular is often custom made. That might not be an issue for you, but if you've never LARPed before and you don't know if you like it, I wouldn't. If you're going to a big fest game that supports this, most of them do, and you want to get a feel for combat without committing financially to battle gear, volunteer to Monster. Everyone massively appreciates it, nobody cares if you're rubbish as long as you're not unsafe, and you don't have to worry about your character dying or providing your own kit, as there is usually dedicated Monster weapons and costumes. That also gives you the opportunity to try out a whole bunch of different weapon and shield combinations to find something that fits your style and how you enjoy fighting. If you're small, not very strong, and intimidated by some of the other people doing LARP combat too aggressively and not pulling their blows, try spears. If you do want to commit to a weapon early on, buy a basic sword, something like this. Look at maybe investing in a small shield longer term and get as much use out of it as you can. It may not be perfectly on brief for every character, but it's very unlikely to be explicitly off brief for any of them. But if I tried to give armour advice, I would be well out of my depth, because my standard for armour is A, does it look awesome, and B, can I actually move in it, because chainmail is heckin' heavy, my back is already dodgy, there's no way you're safely getting me in full metal armour, and if your rule system punishes me for that, I guess I'm not ever doing combat in your game. Also, combat is only a part of LARP, even Fest LARP, not the whole game, and we need to end the expectation that everyone does, or should want to do, combat. Also, if you are a brand new LARPer, identify as female, and have already assumed that combat is not your thing despite having no access barriers to doing so, nah, go volunteer to Monster. Find the other women and non-men there, hang out with them, and try it at least once before you write it off entirely. Just try it once. It's not difficult. If it was difficult, LARPers couldn't do it. There's a really strong hangover from the old days of LARPing that fighting is a man thing, and if you're not a man, you probably don't want to fight. It's rubbish. Give it a go. I believe in you. So what next? So you've established what bases you need to cover, you've got your brief, you've maybe got some ideas. What now? In future videos, I'm going to cover the main ways I get kit for a character. Firstly, by raiding my existing wardrobe for appropriate modern clothes. Secondly, by shopping secondhand, again, for appropriate modern clothes. And finally, by sewing, which I'm going to do my best to break down to a variety of skill levels. Expect to see a mix of regular commercial sewing patterns, specialized costume patterns, and historical sewing patterns. It can sometimes be hard to identify what looks like fantasy, but once you get your eye in, there is a huge range of options available to you. Let's be honest, I'm also not actually LARPing right now and really bored, so you're probably also going to watch me make a whole heap of random projects. Subscribe! If there are any other subjects you think would be worth covering in this series, don't forget to put them in the comments. I would love to hear all of your suggestions. I might not get to all of them, but I came into LARPing as already a somewhat experienced sewer, so it's always good to know how other people approach things. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave me a like and a comment if you have. Follow me on Instagram if you like cat pictures, and if you'd like to see more of this kind of content in a timely manner instead of a mythical future when I have energy and money, there's a link to my Ko-fi in the description box where you can leave a one-off or reoccurring donation to support the channel and buy more belt pouches. Dream big, and I'll see you in the next installment. Part 2. This is going quite well. I'm gonna wait for the cuckoo clock to finish in case my microphone does pick it up. Clap-de-clap-clap. Clap for take 3. Scroll with the toes.